I'm haunted by a text that I keep on my phone from one of my childhood friends. I'll never forget it. It was 2 months before she died. And she sent me a text, and I was speaking about my bipolar II disorder a long time ago. And she heard the story and she sent me a text, Kyle, and she said, I'm so proud that you're doing this. It was so wonderful to see you speak about it. I've never shared this with anyone in my life, but I was also diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, and it made me feel dirty and ashamed. And from that day forward, I'm a changed woman when it comes to being more open and honest. I'm tired of losing good people to the diseases of mental health and substances.
Welcome to MedCircle's It's All in Your Head podcast. I'm Kyle Kittleson, your guest host today. And that's because I'll be interviewing the typical host of It's All in Your Head, Jackie Colbeth, specifically with her lived experience as living with bipolar II disorder and also alcoholism. Jackie, it's my pleasure to welcome you to your very own podcast. Nice to see you.
Thank you. It is so nice to be welcomed.
First of all, I want to thank you for coming on to share your experience. I have interviewed a number of people on MedCircle with lived experiences, and the feedback is always the same, which is, oh my goodness, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know other people were struggling with this, or I am so thrilled to know I am not alone. Typically, both are the feedback and responses I get. Yeah. My first question to open this up is, how are you feeling about sharing these really personal parts of your life with essentially the public?
Anxious to the point of like stomach knots, okay. I think it's one of those things. I think like most things in life, practice makes perfect. The more you talk about something, the easier it becomes to articulate, the better you are at articulating it. If you're never sharing it, never talking about it, I'm kind of one of those that's like, well, yes, it's wildly uncomfortable, but at the same time, I'm just at a place in my life where I don't care if I'm uncomfortable. I see a lot of people in pain. I've lost a lot of good people in my life to mental illness. So to me, I'm at a point in my life where I'm like, I don't really care if one person hears this and feels comforted. Cool. Yeah. Like, job accomplished.
What would you say was more difficult, managing bipolar II or managing substance use?
Oh, it's a great question. I would say this. Having a problem with alcohol was way easier for me to accept than struggling with a mental illness. It was way easier. It was way more chic. People in the early 2000s, going to rehab was some sort of rite of passage, right? And it was sort of okay to struggle with substance abuse, alcoholism, whatever your poison was. It still was not okay when I was diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, a correct diagnosis, I believe. Finally, it wasn't until 2003, 2004. So I had been sober at that time. I had quit drinking at least a year before I sought treatment for my mental health. And it was, at least I had a map to follow when I got my mental health diagnosis. I had worked a 12-step program. I had used elements of that, which helped me come to an acceptance of sorts. Definitely a true acceptance, really. And use some of the tools there to help me along with the mental health part.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said about how rehab for substance use was almost, you're allowed to go do that.
Totally.
Do you feel like today there is the same stigma of bipolar II disorder that there was when you were diagnosed back in, we'll call it 2003?
I think really, if anything, there's just a stigma still exists because people don't really know bipolar II disorder.
Well, I'll even back up further than that. People don't know bipolar disorder.
Right.
I mean, if one more person tells me, oh, look at her, she's bipolar, or look at him, he's bipolar, because they're screaming or yelling, I mean, it just blows my mind. Yeah.
Right. Which I do. I do that.
Yeah. And I do too,
I do scream and yell sometimes. But I don't think it has anything to do with the being on a spectrum.
Sure.
It's just being human or Italian in my case. Yeah, there's a lot of ignorance about it. People think with bipolar depression, whether it's 1, bipolar 2, wherever you are on that spectrum, people either think you have like a multiple personality disorder, or like you're going to be walking down the street and like happy, and then like 1 second later, your personality kind of switches like a light switch. All things that I haven't found to really be true by and large at all. So I would say there's a huge stigma, but I think too, it's very difficult to diagnose. And I'm not a doctor.
Right. Same.
But we're not doctors, but I think it's a mental illness that's difficult to diagnose because your symptoms can be so different, right? Mm-hmm. Like for me, I'm sort of like the watered down Scotch version, I would call, for common vernacular. I'd call bipolar 2 kind of the watered down Scotch of bipolar I disorder, which is more what they would call manic depressive, which, you are having exceedingly extremes. I had a family member who struggles with this on my father's side. And, there is marked behavioral differences within short amount of time. So it can be very difficult to treat. And then you also too will throw any substance abuse in 80% of people with bipolar disorder of anyone, bipolar 1, 2, the whole spectrum, they have an 85% chance of struggling with that. So now you're putting drugs and alcohol, and then you're going through withdrawal physically from those things on top of struggling with your mental condition. It can be very difficult to accurately diagnose on the first go.
Yeah. And we know that there is a fairly high misdiagnosis rating among all of mental health, but certainly bipolar disorder. And the treatment, again, not a doctor, but the treatment for bipolar disorder often requires medication. And you can imagine if you were misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder and be put on some very serious drugs, how that could lead to other issues.
It's hell. I mean, I'll be honest, the hardest part of my journey was the amount of medication that I was yanked on and off of for a sustained period of time.
What's a sustained period of time?
I mean, I was misdiagnosed starting younger, probably 13 up
with
until
what?
23. So it started out, I would say my journey is like most people. You kind of start to discover whether you're conscious or not, of your mental health around puberty. So what happened was the behavioral changes that people will typically describe. So I was a pretty outgoing, energetic, peppy, spunky kid. Around 8th grade, those weren't necessarily the characteristics that I was exhibiting the most of the time. I would say that I was more melancholy. So my bipolar II disorder presents a lot as depression. It's easy to get misdiagnosed with that because I wasn't having kind of fits of great energy where I felt really great and euphoric and I felt invincible and like $1 million. I had never experienced that. Yeah. So it was one of those things where it was just pretty insidious because I started to just exhibit more depression. So on the spectrum, I was, not wanting to participate. I was an athlete. I'd played sports my whole life. It felt like it took 10 times the amount of energy to go to soccer practice, 10 times the amount of energy to attend class. Yeah. Anyone who struggles with depression knows you're exerting double and you're sustaining like nothing,
Well
so you're like on empty or a ton of coffee or, something to when you're in those periods really.
Mhm.
So when you put I got put on an SSRI, I got put on Zoloft when I was 13. Well, what effect did that have on me? Bing, bing.
Did it put you into a manic state?
It's hard because I don't know if I've experienced a true manic state with the way that my bipolar 2 manifests. I'll have irritability where I do feel like way more irritable than I should or the situation requires.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's something I'm just conscious of that, okay, I was getting excited but irritable, like a lot of energy, but maybe not, maybe it was nervous energy a little more than like, hey, I'm starting to feel good.
Because you're 13, you've just explained how every 13-year-old is excited and irritable and doesn't want to go to class. And it's really hard to go to soccer practice. How did you know, and maybe you didn't, did anyone know that this was more than just teenagers being teenagers and this was an actual issue that needed to be addressed?
I think really, when you're 13, unless you're, a ward of the state, you have parents, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, in my parents were always very hip to mental health. It wasn't anything in our home that was a stigma. People in my family struggle with this.
Look, at full disclosure, Jackie and I know each other from childhood, and I can attest to her family's openness. Yes. You guys are very open with one another. That was not, I didn't see many families like that. You guys were very, I always thought, man, the Colbeths really run like a clan. Like they're together, and they tell each other everything,
Well, my father's Scottish. There may be something to that. It is totally clan oriented, and you're right. And so I was fortunate. So I was brought. Now I think my parents too, like most parents, they were conscious that depression runs in the family. When I'm 13, I don't know about family history. I don't know what signs to look for. So I had parents who were exceedingly, tuned in. And at that time, whether I agree with it or not really wasn't the point. It was they were in a position where they saw changes going on with their daughter. They saw her starting to use substances, starting to abuse substances. That's something for them where they just understandably weren't willing to mess around with. So I was sent to talk to a psychiatrist and was put on medication. And that was really the route at that age presented to me. Now, at 13, do I think I comprehended anything going on? Not, and it's not, no. I don't know if a 13-year-old can comprehend things like mental health and what you can do to improve that and what your options are and becoming educated. You don't know. So whether you're facing a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, when you're in your teens, you don't know what you don't know. And no offense to teenagers, they don't know a lot yet.
Yeah, I get that. So when you went to that psychiatrist when you were 13, was that your first experience getting mental health treatment?
It was my first experience, and I didn't say a word the entire hour.
So this individual was just asking you questions and you weren't saying a word?
They'd ask questions and they'd have a long pause, and then I just had the longest pause, really, I guess.
Why weren't you talking?
I was angry I even had to go. So I was that kid that was like, I think in my head going, great, I'm going to walk right in to this stigma. I don't belong here. Now this is, I was resentful that I even had to go talk to someone because in my 13-year-old mind, all of this seemed really excessive and not something to panic about. And from what I can comprehend at the time, I felt like, great, like this is really kind of setting me apart. It's not like my girlfriends at soccer practice have to go talk to someone like this.
Yeah. So when you had this experience, sounds like you're shut off from it, but you were put on an SSRI. Did your symptomology or did your substance use increase, decrease, or stay the same?
I think it stayed the same.
Okay.
I would say, because it was very much at a younger age. So I had my first drink at 12.
Wow.
I think I got drunk first at 12.
Do you remember feeling really good when you had alcohol in your system?
I just remember feeling a sense of like peace. And what I mean by that,
pretty good.
Well, it was like a pause, right? Like, I have an active brain, meaning it's much like a NASCAR track. Even if I look like I'm, just zoned out, it's running fast. There's multiple tracks. So when I took a sip of alcohol and I ingested, a depressant effectively, I think I just went, I'm not thinking about the past.
Yeah.
I ain't thinking about the future. This is like, to me, it was just like kind of a pause, a mental pause that I needed and then just wanted.
Yeah.
From there on out.
I always wonder about that because you're not the only adolescent to go try alcohol.
No.
And many of them try alcohol and then either never do it again or it becomes something that they can manage in their life. And then for others, it becomes something that it couldn't be managed. Where was the time between I'm taking nips, as you put it, from at 12 years old to hold on, do I have a problem with substance use?
Oh, yeah. That would 12, the first residential rehabilitation center I went to for alcohol I was 16. So
4 years later, it had reached a critical point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it advanced. It was binge-like, because mind you, I'm in high school. I'm playing very competitive sports. There was a level of maintenance I'd try hard to do. You can't miss school. You can't miss soccer, so I was binging. So it was apparent to me at a very young age, not only could I not have just one drink, I didn't want one drink. I don't see the point in one drink. To me, it was sort of like, well, this kind of is what it is. But it was getting to a point where at that age, I was just kind of a potpourri of I remember testing positive. I'm not proud, but at any one time you could have opiates, amphetamines, marijuana, psychedelics. You're just testing positive down the line.
Yeah.
And at that point, how do you get a baseline for if you have an underlying mental health issue? You're never going to get a baseline if you don't get off the substances. At least I couldn't. I waited a whole year before I even addressed my mental health because I thought, I've been pumped full of drugs, both illegal and legal.
Yeah.
From a very young age. So I don't have a baseline as an adult. I haven't had a year where there hasn't been something, I'm taking for my mental health, good or bad.
Yeah. I mean, the MedCircle doctors will more or less say the same thing. If you can't rule that out first, it's hard to really address the true symptoms behind it, because how do you know what's coming from what? You also reminded me of something when you said you were making sure that things stayed afloat, that you went to class, that you played competitive sports. And that really echoes a conversation you had with a gentleman who was struggling with digital addiction in your first season of your podcast.
Yeah, Charlie.
And this is a guy who's maintaining jobs, maintaining grades, maintaining relationships, but gaming and spending time on the internet to such a degree that he could only maintain everything. There was no growth. And for those of us looking in, imagine looking at Jackie at 15 and we go, well, there's an all-star athlete and there's a girl who goes to school all the time and, blah, blah, blah. You would go, well, she can't have any issues. She can't be struggling because look at all of the things that are on paper that are positive. And I like to highlight that because we can't assume that the picture we're being shown is the full story. And that's critical for parents, caregivers, whoever to understand.
Well, and how many times too, Kyle, do you read articles and let's say someone passes to suicide?
Mm-hmm.
How many times in the articles do you hear the loved ones and the friends go, I had no idea.
I had no idea.
And you think, oh, like surely, no, they had no idea.
Yeah.
Or they had no idea the severity. I mean, it's really kind of one or the other, I feel like, because we're humans. We can do an unbelievable job of deceit and deceiving people. And it's part of survival to me. If I wasn't actively trying to deceive you into not looking at me, then you wouldn't see my problem. Then you wouldn't ask me to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't have to go through the pain of going through it. To me, that was just something that you have to try to work through.
Yeah, deceit is a powerful action, whether it's done consciously or unconsciously. I would also add that denial is fairly powerful or very powerful. And I speak to denial on the supporter side. I'm curious to know if you think, your opinion, if there were people in your life who were just in denial. Because what I'm getting are 12 years old, you're drinking. It gets so bad that we need residential treatment program. But there were 4 years in between there. Part of me is going, well, what was going on during those 4 years? Was anyone in denial?
I think people were it was hidden. And maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, but I suppose if you're in denial, you might not look too hard at me. It's hard to say. My parents surely weren't ever in denial.
Okay.
And I would attribute that as a major part of why I'm even here today talking to you. The two people who were responsible, for my adolescent, but at the time really pulled out all the stops just to make sure I lived to tell and that I lived another day. I mean, I don't have children of my own, but I can imagine as it's been described to me, you have a child and you're afraid they're going to die, whether it's by their own hand on purpose or accidental. You're going to do anything. You're going to do anything you think, whether it's right, whether it's wrong in hindsight, whether it helped or whether it hurt, you're going to take the step to at least try to make an effort. And they did. And
part of that effort was this rehab facility at 16. How did that go?
Oh, that was like an epic flop.
It was a flop.
Well, I think it was one of those things where I was there for probably 3 months.
Inpatient for 3 months at 16.
They had a accredited high school. So it was kind of one of those, it was, I say like nice rehabs. Well, go to one and tell me, how wonderful, you think they might be. 3 months. I mean, I was it was not my banner year. And it's
why did it not work? What made it a flop?
Sure. Well, one, on the alcoholism piece, at 16, I wasn't even remotely close to getting the crux of that program, which is I'm an alcoholic. I got a problem with drinking. I'm never going to do it normally. And if I continue, I'm probably going to die.
And did you want to stop drinking?
Well, of course not. I mean, at that, because in the teenage years, you go, well, I'm a teenager. Everything you said. I mean, so no. And I fought this all very hard. I was not really compliant in my treatment at all. It wasn't anything I was near ready to accept. So that's one reason I don't think it was successful long term. It's hard to ask adults to do that.
Yes.
You're going to ask a teenager to like really go deep and look at all their uglies. They haven't even had enough time in their life to have their ugliness impact anyone else. Yeah. And like maybe their parents, but at 16, I wasn't trashing marriages, friends, work. There's so much more as an adult that is motivating for you to deal with things. At 16, I really didn't feel like I was losing anything of major importance.
A lot of parents are going to hear that, and they're going to have a 16-year-old who's struggling with substance use and go, well, shoot, then why even send my 16-year-old to rehab? It didn't work for Jackie. Do you think there's a way that 16-year-old Jackie could have been successful at rehab?
No.
So it's just a time thing then.
And you're right. I don't mean it because the education wasn't there. It was. I don't mean that because the support wasn't there. The support was there. I didn't want it. So I never embraced it. I would suffer through it. I would go through the motions. I would do the celebrations, but not at any given time was I accepting or responsive.
Yeah.
Not until I was on my own at 22 was I responsive to anything.
Okay, so let's talk about 16 to 22 then. You get out of this rehab, you call it an epic flop. What does your life look like?
Boarding school.
Oh, so your parents said, okay, and if that didn't work, now we'll try boarding school. Bye-bye.
Yeah. And at that time, it was actually, people don't believe this because they think it's like a military school experience. That wasn't my experience. Like I went to a prep school on the East Coast to finish out high school. It was a good option for a few reasons. One, it gave me an opportunity to kind of have a fresh playground, so to speak. I can go in there and do really well and sort of get a fresh start away from any temptations, away from any negative people or influences in my life. It was new. So there was that. And then there was the component as I had a younger brother who's 5 years my junior, and the amount of time and attention and emotion that my parents were dedicating toward me, and I can really deplete your resources, I think, to a degree in that department. I mean, you're not kind of tired. You're probably totally exhausted. Yeah. And it was getting to the point where, my brother was being neglected in the time that he deserved, in the relationship he deserved to have with my parents. Being so preoccupied with me, it was impacting my brother too. And to remove myself from the situation was also good for him at that time. And it was good for me.
Yeah. Did you feel guilty about that?
To this day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I've certainly made amends. I've reconciled. My brother is I love him maybe more than anyone. I was racked with guilt. When you sit a 16-year-old down and you tell them, because of you, this is why we have to do this. And it's because your brother is neglected. I mean, any loving sibling is going to feel bad. And I felt horrible. And so I went on the plane and I went away, and I, at 16 to live by myself, in large part because I didn't want to negatively impact my brother. We're very close. He's been such a supporter of me that really for me at 16, the big moment was, okay, you don't want this impacting Brett. So away I went, amends I made, my amends was accepted. And to his point, at 16, it's not like you're setting out consciously to hurt people. When you're in the throes of a mental illness, you're in the throes of addiction, it really isn't something to be taken personal. And I know it doesn't feel that way, but it's not. There was not, I didn't wake up and be like, I want to suck all the attention off my beloved sibling.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't, but that's really kind of the reality of what happened. So that was the predicate to, to get out of the house and live apart from my family.
So as you're living apart, are you still struggling with symptoms of bipolar disorder, and are you still using substances?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was living apart from about 16, 17, through college. So I never lived at home again.
Wow.
After I went and lived at a boarding school. So I never lived at home again. So all of that was going on. But again, it was kind of like out of sight, out of mind. She's, going to school. There's not anything I can point to that, she's really screwing up at to say anything, to have any sort of, foundation for a valid concern.
You're saying that your parents, because you were at the school and you were pretty much just going to school, living your life, they didn't have any reason to be upset or think anything was wrong.
No, I mean, I wasn't getting arrested. I wasn't living near them. So I wasn't physically seeing them frequently at all.
Yeah.
There was no way. I mean, unless I was getting reprimanded or getting in trouble, there's no way they would have really been able to witness any of that.
Did you feel discarded at all?
Oh, yeah.
You did.
Well,
So
yeah, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you feel like a stain.
Mm.
Like you're such bad news bears that you now have to get out of here. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of a feeling of of course you feel abandoned, you feel dumped, kind of, geez, this was so big of a problem. Now here I am, kind of alone and isolated. It's almost kind of the opposite feeling of what I think you would want someone who's experiencing mental health to feel, which would be included, supported. But a lot of times the way symptoms manifest or behaviors manifest, it's hard for that person to do it and look past, what's Jackie and what's Jackie if she's just in a bad space. There's a difference, and people who would know me would know that difference. But yes, it's a feeling of rejection, abandonment, discardment, embarrassment, shame. I mean, it's like I call it like a cocktail of crap that you get to feel, in addition to being like, okay, well, how do I help myself? How do I feel better? Can I feel better? Will I? You have a lot going on internally in addition to all the external stuff that's usually coming at you too.
Yeah, when we hear it from this perspective, this lived experience perspective, you've clearly stated on one hand that this was done from love and supportiveness and with the best intentions, and on the other hand, you can't help but feel the cocktail of crap because of the nature of what has happened to a child.
Right.
16-year-old, you are a child.
Right.
I think at 22, you're still kind of a child, honestly.
Yeah, you really are. I mean, I certainly was, at least.
Yeah, same. So I understand. You said that so perfectly. I think that was really great that people will hear that part of it. So from 16 to 22, you've gone through the boarding school, you've gone through college, you are still you're still struggling with symptoms of bipolar disorder. What is the catalyst then at 22? And that is young to say, really, all right, I'm going to stop this. I don't know. I didn't meet one 22-year-old who ever had a desire to stop drinking. I haven't met that person. Yeah.
Yeah, I really didn't either. And I can attest, at least in Chicago, there were some at that time that I got to know. But I think what happened was the treatment and the intervention I had had as an adolescent, while I was too young to do anything with it, it was like you planted a seed in my head that between the age of 16 to 22, there was this seed like, well, you don't drink normally. You always overdo it. You always got to make phone calls the next day after you really tied one on, and your other friends aren't doing that. What I say, who'd I offend? Who is owed an apology? Anyone gets like, who experiences that, can get that. But it's there were seeds that were planted, and it's funny, there really wasn't any one event. There was no arrests. There was no job loss. There was no nothing. I literally was just drinking a lot. I was doing a lot of drugs, a lot of cocaine at that time. And I literally remember coming home, and I'd been I was awake for the last 3 days, and I was 22 years old, and I was sitting in my room in downtown Chicago in my apartment, and my best friend, my roommate, was just like, I'm out of here. You've now moved into a new realm where it's, you're bringing people in the house. It's not good for me. It's not a good deal for me anymore. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, if I keep this up, I do think I'm going to die, at risk of being real depressing or macabre. It was just this overwhelming feeling of if you don't stop, you're done, your luck's going to run out. I just had this overwhelming kind of spiritual experience, and I'm not particularly religious. But it was kind of a out of body experience where I just kind of felt this sentiment so deeply that I woke up the next morning, and I was living near Newbury Park, for the Chicagoans who might be watching. And I was living across from Hazelden, which was a substance abuse center, and they had an outpatient court place. And I just trotted right through Newbury Park, and I knocked on the door, and someone opened it, and I was like, I really want to quit drinking, and I've tried to do it on my own, and I'm just never successful. I never get any time allotted. I don't know how. Yeah. I want to, but I can't. Do you have any program I can enroll in?
And they said yes.
And they said yes. And I was working full time at a large newspaper downtown. I had a great job. I had great friends. I had things that were going for me in my life, but spiritually did not reflect any of the good. So, you're at such a disconnect. And if you try to quit, I tried to quit so often on my own, it didn't work. I finally was like, okay, well, at what point, do I at least open my ears a little bit?
Yeah. The seed, let's go back to that. The seed that was planted. Mm-hmm. That I want to ring loud and clear for listeners and supporters, especially of young people who are struggling with substance use. Jackie just painted the picture perfectly. She's feeling shame, resentful. She's feeling discarded. She's in a boarding school very far away. And you could be sitting there as the parent going, oh my gosh, I hope we're doing something good for our child that we love so much. And like a seed, you might not see the first leaves sprouting from that seed until much, much later. And when I interviewed Andrea Arlington, who is a ICF life coach, and she specializes in addiction and family addiction that surrounds that, she really echoed a lot of what you just said in her approach to helping family members, because we want other people to do what we want them to do, but that is not always going to happen. And don't discount that fight, that discussion, that emotional time, that boarding school trip. Those all are potential seeds that can sprout. And I think for the supporters out there, just keep planting those seeds, because the more we plant, the more likely one of them will turn into a plant, And
Kyle too, it's important. I love that you brought her up, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this too. most people who struggle with mental health issues, someone in their family before them has struggled with either the same issue or similar. It's genetic. Many of them are genetic, right? Many are passed down. My family tree, go check out every branch of it. I did. I mean, you will see these things run in families. So like the likelihood of someone like me at 16 in some sort of facility, you can guarantee either a parent, uncle, aunt, anyone, just go within your family tree. There is usually someone who's experienced something similar. So while at the same time, we were very focused on me and my symptoms and in my bipolar II disorder, there are people in my family who were struggling and undiagnosed at that time, which adds an added element, to where genetics are just very powerful and they're not something to be dismissed.
No question. Yeah. Especially with treatment too. Even, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder at 9 and they were very interested to see the depression history in my family and what medications have been effective for family members because they wanted to start with those. I'm all about genetics. Okay. So at 22, you have this, let's call it what it is, this spiritual moment where you have this overwhelming feeling of things need to change. You take action right away. You're no longer the 16-year-olds being told they need to change. You're an aspiring adult who is taking over their life. That all sounds really good. Was everything just fabulous from there on out?
No.
And then it was all easy and life has never been easier again.
No.
Darn it. Shoot. I thought you were going to have the answer.
I mean, me personally, for the audience, I can't BS, I eyes wide open, right? So when I tell you, for me, it was difficult. That is in no way, shape, or form. I don't want people to feel like it's daunting. I just want to be honest.
But isn't it daunting, though?
It is. It
well,
is a little daunting.
To me, that sounds daunting.
It was daunting, but what happens is you lose your substances and you don't quite know how to cover or work with your emotions. So it's for me, I remember not being able to put a name tag on a feeling. And what I mean by that was I had a lot of anger that was pushed down. Substances, I think, helped suppress that. And that has to have some place to go or get addressed when you take your medication, your self-medication away. So for me, my early sobriety was both empowering because I felt like I had a sense of agency and I was accumulating more days without picking up a drink. And that was fantastic. But at the same time, I've never wanted to commit more felonies than in early sobriety.
Wow.
Because it was I wasn't equipped. So if everything for me is associated with, anger or just, kind of a bad attitude or aggressiveness, that was because I had no concept how to deal with it. I remember I was in an outpatient treatment after doing, or an aftercare. I did outpatient while I was working full time when I was 22. So that was 6 weeks of going to this place for hours at night after a full day of work. Yeah. And then you do this aftercare. And by the time I got to aftercare and I was probably 4 or 5 months without a drink, there was a joke amongst the class that you're liable to, get jackied, or someone was going to go Jackie on you. It had turned into an adjective, the class was well aware of. So it wasn't until kind of cleaning some of the gunk out that everything I responded, every emotion, I didn't know what it felt like to feel disappointed. I couldn't identify what felt shameful. I couldn't identify what felt good and empowering. I just couldn't identify disappointment. There were lots of emotions that just didn't have any sort of place or identity. And I remember specifically, I was dating a guy I was really crazy about. We'd broken up. He was, seeing some other girl at the time. I was just like totally devastated. I was so sad about this, especially because I initiated it. So I thought, this is what you did. This was your fault. Totally. And I remember I was out with friends and I was just rah, 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 and I can't believe in her this and blah, blah. And I got done and one of them just looked at me. He was sipping on a Diet Coke and he said, "So you're sad?" And I'm like, in my mind, I'm thinking, sad? Were you absent for my tirade? I'm quite angry. And he said, "No, you sound like you feel sad and rejected." And I went, "Oh."
It's nice to have friends who can reflect back like that.
I mean, godsends, really. I mean, you talk about that moment happened decades ago. I was at Daisy Thai at 900 North Michigan. I remember the table I was sitting in. Like, if I get really good advice, to me, it's like the moment where I'll remember where I was, what I was wearing, who I was sitting with. And that really struck me. I was like,
well, and maybe it is good advice. It's also being seen. Being seen for the truth, and you can be angry and sad. Those often co-occur.
Totally.
Did you ever relapse?
I've never had a drink since. Well, I've not had a drink since August 18th of 2003.
Wow! Congratulations. How does that feel?
It feels good. It's something that I tell people. At the end of the day, if it were so great, I would start, if it were so awful, I should say, if not drinking was unbearable, you can always go back. But for some reason, I have chosen not to because I find that my life is more bearable once I eliminated it.
Is it easier now to not drink than it was 10 years ago?
I think I'm very lucky. Everyone's experiences are different. Right. I mean, I had gotten sort of the desire more or less, I think, lifted, which is otherworldly because that's really not how it was for a long time. Obviously, the desire was there and kind of in control. And I had that very spiritual, kind of spooky to me moment, to be honest. And I think that scared the living crap out of me. Like, to this day, I believe what I felt that day to be true. And there is like no greater motivator to me than fear.
Whew.
I'm motivated by fear and I am terrified of what's going to happen to me if I embrace alcohol again. Yeah. We've talked, I want to touch back on bipolar II. As you are entering sobriety, did your symptoms of bipolar II disorder become more blatant? I think they were just so much more noticeable because I couldn't attribute them to anything.
Right. That's what I would think.
Yeah. Like if I'm hungover as hell on a Sunday and I'm feeling depressed, it's only because I have the Sunday scaries. Yeah. It couldn't have anything to do with my need to want to be inebriated or whatever, you know, however I was feeling it that time.
Yeah.
So that was definitely something that I felt.
Now, I've shared, not that these are apples to apples, but for a long time, my own process of accepting myself as a gay man.
Yeah.
That was years and years and years. And I was going through it and I didn't even know I was going through it until I go, oh, I've got some issues I need to address.
Yeah.
Did you have any, because you mentioned this at the top of the interview, now, or even in your older age, when you're in the midst of your sobriety, did you have any self-loathing because of your bipolar II diagnosis?
It was the most loathsome thing about me.
So you really carried that like, oh, I just hate that.
I mean, I
have
carried
bipolar.
it to the point where I would have other people diagnosed with much more severe, say it crosses to bear when it came to their mental health.
Mhm.
I basically had them looking at me like, well, sack up.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So you got a little bipolar too. Come on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, and it was kind of like, and also too, a lot of this is in my head. It's my insecurity, and I find a lot is in presentation and how you present something. So early sobriety, I didn't want anyone to know that I was a recovering alcoholic.
So you're sober, but you don't want people to know you're a recovering alcoholic.
No, I mean, they can figure if they can do deductive reasoning, like I drink, I don't drink.
Right.
I was really wild. Now I'm quite boring social life, like you can do the.
I can't imagine you ever being boring, but continue. Yeah.
Maybe not boring, but not fun.
Okay.
Probably not as fun to be around. But it's, I was very ashamed of my alcoholism, just like I was ashamed of having bipolar II disorder. I thought it made me ugly, unwanted. So I wouldn't offer that up. Now, I would obviously I wasn't drinking. I worked in sales, in media sales. So I'm around alcohol all day, every day. And it's a big part of my job. So people knew I didn't drink, but that's kind of where it started and stopped. For all they knew, I could have had celiac disease.
There could have been lots of people don't drink and, for any other reason.
Yeah. I mean, but at the same time too, and, I never met many people that didn't drink, at all. Like that was odd. And it was an oddity at 22. And in my younger years, it was difficult because I was young and I was in my 20s and I wanted to go out like everyone else did. And I was living in Chicago and it was just an awesome city and I had a great job. And you're there, but you're also just inundated still, with alcohol. But at a very young age, people in the place I worked knew I had quit. I didn't receive a lot of pressure at all. By and large, people were quite respectful. But it was an oddity. I mean, I would have been lying. I was the only person at events not drinking.
Yeah. Club soda and lime with a straw.
In a rock glass. So you just don't even. Yeah.
Today, not to speak for you, but you seem to have accepted these two facets of your life. The case in point, we're literally talking about it to 1.5 million subscribers.
Yeah, no bigs.
So I assume there's some acceptance here. How did you reach that acceptance?
This is going to sound kind of whack. I've never heard it. Okay, it might even sound arrogant. I don't really care because this is just going to answer your question. I think I really accepted my bipolar II disorder when I realized there are plenty of people with no disorders who are just crappy people. Like they're not good people.
Hey, get there however you can get there, I think. And you are right. Dr. Ramani has told me, she goes, look, there is not a diagnosis for being a jerk. Okay. Like some people are just jerks. And that doesn't have to be in the DSM for us to know.
No. And furthermore from that, it's really easy not to carry a stigma if you choose never to get diagnosed. Yeah. I would say that too.
Amen.
That's one of those things to me where there are plenty of people with mental illness that won't diagnose it, don't diagnose it. So they're running around without the stigma, but that's just because they're not getting diagnosed. They're not dealing with it.
Yeah. And I guess there is truth to that. I'll also counter that diagnosis. The MedCircle doctors have really influenced my perception of diagnosis. I used to be so I wanted to know the diagnosis. And when I would interview the MedCircle doctors, I was like, but what is the criteria for the diagnosis? How do we reach diagnostic criteria for this and this and this and this? I wanted to know. And there is importance to that because diagnosis informs treatment, and treatment is how we take the next steps. But you have to get the correct diagnosis for that. But to take it one step further, at the end of the day, whether you got 7 of the 9 symptoms or 5 of the 6 symptoms, we're really just dealing with symptoms.
Yes. Yes.
And all of us deal with symptoms.
Yes.
Some of us have created the symptoms and we have enough and it reaches some diagnostic criteria in a book that a whole bunch of, older white men created many, long ago. So okay, great. But we're all dealing with symptoms. Right. We're all dealing with symptoms. And when we look at the mental health, our lives, our emotions, ourselves as these collection of symptoms, to me, that starts to destigmatize it. Yep. Because I can say Jackie's living with bipolar disorder, and I'm living with being sad a little bit, and I'm living with being happy sometimes, and I'm living we all are living with a collection of symptoms.
We are, and something too. Part of a motivator for me to stay on top of my own mental health, and I've lost a lot of friends to suicide. To me, I think it's an understatement to say it happens too much. But after I lost my last friend a few years ago is when I had developed, I think, a righteous anger that such wonderful people were dying. It's such a clip. And worse than them dying, they thought the world would be a better place, and they did it themselves. And to me, after we lost our last friend, something kind of snapped in me where I said, you know what? I don't know if sharing my story would have helped any of my friends who've died. I don't. But I have to imagine that even if you thought there was a fractional % of a chance that it could, you want to do it to honor them. I'm haunted by a text that I keep on my phone from one of my childhood friends, who out of respect, I'll say she passed younger, and it was at her own hands. And I'll never forget, it was 2 months before she died. And she sent me a text, and I was speaking about my bipolar II disorder a long time ago. And she heard the story, and she sent me a text, Kyle, and she said, I'm so proud that you're doing this. It was so wonderful to see you speak about it. I've never shared this with anyone in my life, but I was also diagnosed with bipolar II disorder, and it made me feel dirty and ashamed. And I've not shared it with anyone but you. And from that day forward, I'm a changed woman when it comes to being more open and honest, because I have to imagine this particular friend or myself were able to connect with other people, we could look at as maybe like a role model or like a mentor. If it was talked about more, I do think maybe, hey, there was a shot she might be alive. I don't know that. But I'm tired of losing good people to the diseases of mental health and substances.
Yeah. And you're not alone with that tiredness.
No.
And I think in what you're doing, and not just in an interview, but what you're doing with MedCircle, what you do outside of MedCircle, I think is really helpful with that. So I applaud you, Jackie, and thank you for your honesty and transparency today and all days. I really value and appreciate that.
Some more than others.
No, I always appreciate honesty. So you end your podcast episodes by asking your guests what's one piece of advice that they could share with the audience that would help them. I will float your very own question right back to you to wrap up this episode.
If you're going through hell, keep going. This too shall pass in a similar vein. And the reason I give those is my most sincere, heartfelt suggestion to anyone who is struggling right now is because I remember when I was struggling, it is all you can do to, like we said earlier, keep the bus moving. And the reason I think it's so important to just try to keep going is because circumstances change. Nothing's static. And if you can you don't even have to do it gracefully or well, but if you're feeling like you're losing hope, grab onto something. You're going through hell, please just keep going, because I guarantee you, if you do keep going, there is the ability to come out onto the other side. You don't have to revisit the same awful, dark place that you were at. And you will be able to get more perspective in hindsight. But there is no, again, in the spirit of, no BS, sometimes it is white knuckling it just to get to the next day, especially if you're suicidal. You're working extra hard to stay here and keep it alive. And it's that serious. So I would just say, please, by the grace of God, try to just keep going and give yourself the opportunity to get to a better place if you can.
Yeah. And you can. Yes, Jackie, thank you. I really appreciate that. We are going to link to some very beneficial resources in the description of this video, including MedCircle's suicide prevention resources. And of course, you can go to MedCircle.com and look at our membership offerings. They are a great companion to whatever your mental health care journey is. You can also download the MedCircle app for free and visit watch.medcircle.com to see our entire video library and backlog of live workshops featuring psychologists and psychiatrists from MedCircle. Jackie, thank you again. Appreciate you.
Kyle.
I'm Kyle Kittleson, your guest host for the day. Remember, whatever you're going through, you got this.